for this kind introduction. Thanks everyone for showing up this early. Don't worry, it will be the last talk, so you won't have to suffer through this. By you. By me, by me, of course. I want to thank, of course, the organizers for inviting me to what is my first Evolang ever, first of many, I hope. It's particularly gratifying to see so many people coming from different fields. I wish all our theoretical linguistics conferences were of this kind. And so I will try to give you, each and every one of you something in this presentation. I'll be particularly critical of the kind of theoretical linguistics that I have done so far. Okay? And I've tried to reach a consensus view that may surprise some of you or please others of you. I'll start with someone that makes a few of you at least uncomfortable. I apologize. This is Noam Chomsky. I'll start with giving you a bit of background for what's coming up in this talk. I'll give you sort of a few sources of influence for what's coming up. And Chomsky is certainly one of the main sources that I will draw from, not the only one by any means. Second person that I'll rely on is Dick Lewontin. The third person is Mark Hauser. And the fourth one, perhaps some of you can't recognize him, it's David Puppel. I'll rely on them in this particular order. I had the great fortune to interact with all of them for many years and learn from them. And what you'll get today is basically what I've tried to gather from these interactions. From Chomsky, I'll borrow the idea that certain aspects of the thing that we call language in everyday conversation can be studied in a scientific manner as part of the subject matter of biology. So, I see it's not that scary. I'm not going to assume more than this. And if we do so, according to Chomsky, then we could try to understand or at least shed some light on what makes us human ultimately. Okay? Once you take this stance that some have called the biological or biolinguistic stance, then a lot of things begin to make sense in the context of language, especially in the context of language acquisition. This was the main message of the work of Eric Lenneberg. But it's fair to say, and here I agree with Ray Jackendoff, that as the particular stance that Chomsky took developed, we have often gotten lost in our, theoretical discussions and have lost track of the biological commitment that was at the very beginning and center of the enterprise. It's been sort of displaced to the periphery. And I think that in large part, the followers of Chomsky's program are to blame for this. Okay, and what I would like to try to do is sort of remedy that situation a little bit in ways that you will see. Okay, so I think that it's fair to say that today theoretical linguistics, with this biological commitment, has sort of regressed, and it would be nice to do something about it. Okay. This is a quote from Salvador Luria in 1976 in a AAAS address, where he actually discussed the field of biolinguistics and ends his discussion saying, this is a field for the future. In a couple of years, we'll see really great progress. This wasn't quite right on target, I think. In particular, Luria predicted in 76 that within a couple of years, we would have linguists and biologists talking to one another. And specifically, we would have linguists looking at biological data and trying to just make interesting hypotheses about the data. That hasn't happened. I mean, if you think, for example, of the FOXP2 discovery, it's been fantastic. I think, but it's not been so great for the theoretical linguists. They haven't had much to say once they've gotten confronted with data that's particularly interesting and should be relevant. Okay? Nonetheless, I think that things could change for a variety of reasons. One, we are getting, and we will get in the future, better and better data coming from the biologists, and this is a source of data that we cannot afford to ignore or remain silent on. We also have, I think, a better theoretical stance. Now, if I say minimalism, I'll try not to mention the terms too many times. Don't think that I'm buying into a particular theoretical package. I just mean that many linguists of a Chomskyan persuasion have come to realize that their theory of universal grammar is so baroque as to be implausible, and this is all I mean by minimalism. So they've tried to actually do what other traditions in linguistics had done before, namely minimize that component to just make it somewhat more plausible. In addition, I think that we are gradually moving away from Broca, Wernicke, and that's it for language and the brain. I think we have moved way beyond the classical model, and this will be particularly useful because we may then try to make more informed hypotheses about how language is implemented in the brain. And last but not least, we've also, well, some haven't really, but some are moving beyond the modern synthesis in biology, moving beyond a narrow set of hypotheses with respect to evolution in general. And as the theory of biology expands, we have more room to find our place in it. Okay? So for all these things, I think that it's worth reconsidering the biological stance of theoretical linguistics. Bearing in mind, of course, that what we will find is likely to be messy and complex in a way that Lewontin has told us many, many times. You just read the triple helix and you realize that the story is not going to be maybe interesting, but it's not going to be clean. Okay? This is the extended synthesis model that's of a particularly interesting sort for us. I think that we have moved beyond neo-Darwinism to entertain a set of hypotheses. If this works, this doesn't seem to. But anyway, we have basically entertaining an expanded range of concepts to deal with the origin of certain traits, and I think that linguists will benefit from just having more hypotheses to draw from. We can finally forget some caricatures and rely more on what Gould had told us, especially what Gould had told Dan Dennett that you see on the picture. Dan Dennett didn't listen particularly well on that day. The third source of influence that I will draw from is Mark Hauser and the sort of approach that other people following Mark has done. Here you have on your left the famous or infamous, depending on where you come from, FLN, FLB distinction. The talk I gave on Monday urged theoretical linguists to forget that particular distinction. I don't think it's well-grounded, biologically speaking, but it was a first try that was influential, if only because Chomsky seemed to have endorsed it at one point. And it was specifically useful, at least as far as I'm concerned, in drawing attention to the richness of FLB. So I don't want you to ask me too many questions about what's specific in FLN. I know this is what gets theoretical linguists excited. I think this is the wrong source of excitement. The source of excitement really is FLB. Okay? here I have a quote from Tecumseh Fitch from a 2011 paper, and I'll read bits and pieces of it to make you realize that the Fitch of the Hauser-Chomsky and Fitch paper have finally come to realize that from a biological point of view, this sharp distinction FLN, FLB is not, at least from a biological viewpoint, is not particularly good. Okay, Fitch, for example, has written that from a biological viewpoint, this distinction between what's specifically linguistic and what's more generally cognitive, cognitive is unproductive and misleading. I think he was quite right about this, even though following the 2002 paper, it seems like everyone was trying to draw a very sharp distinction between the two. And if you ask the biologists, they will tell you this is no good way to do biology. Okay? Today, I will not have much to say about what FLN is if we abandon the FLN-FLB distinction. This is the topic of innovation in biology, specifically related to language in this context, and it relates to Evo in a way that I've talked on Monday, and so I won't say anything about this today. What I will focus on, of course, is how we could, as theoretical linguists, make informed and informative hypotheses about evolution. Okay? And here you have my friend Gary Marcus waving his hands, repeating that if you want to move from here to there, you have to be careful, because genes build neural structures. Well, even that's not true, but anyway. Genes build, certainly they don't build behavior. I mean, there are a couple of steps in between, say, cognition and evolution that cannot be ignored if you want to make interesting hypotheses. And what I will try to do today is precisely following that advice. That is, I'll first give you a couple of theoretical notions and try to map them onto the brain as we know it. And from there on, ask questions about the evolution of those brain structures, and then see if we can relate those three domains. Okay? And in order to do this, I'll take inspiration from a research program that David Puppel has been advocating. I don't think that it has received the attention it deserves. What Puppel is basically saying, this is an abstract of a recent paper really clearly summarizing what he's after. What David Puppel is urging us is that both evolutionary and genetic approaches to studying the biological foundations of speech and language could benefit from fractionating the problem at a finer grain. And the point shouldn't be to aim at mapping genetics to language, or mapping genetics to phonology or syntax or semantics or whichever field you prefer, but rather to link genetic results to component formal operations that underlie what we've called syntax, phonology, semantics, and so on. And Puppel in particular stresses the fact that these operations are likely to be generic, not specific to language. They are what he calls generic subroutines, and I'll try to make hypotheses in this direction. So the theoretical linguists among you may ask me in the question period, but this is not quite, linguistic. I mean, this is certainly not the kind of specificity that we love to see in the generative literature, for example. And my answer will be yes, that's not that. Okay? All right, let's skip a few more things. And so, a warning, what follows is not going to be the orthodox kind of theoretical linguistics with which I may be associated, but it won't also be the kind of orthodox biology that many people tend to assume, but I don't know of any easy way. Okay, that is, we'll have to both make victims on the biology side and also on the linguistic side. Okay? And part of the motivation, the final motivation that I'll follow, are certain remarks by Chomsky. And this is not perhaps the best quote. This one is more famous or well-known. That goes way back to 1965 and 1976, where Chomsky talked about principles of neural organizations that may be even more deeply grounded in physical law. Or he asks about whether we know, in fact he's skeptical about, that, whether we know what happens when, as many neurons as we have are crammed into something the size of a basketball. What happens in this particular case? And I'll address this particular issue because I think that since 1976 we have come to learn more about what could happen in this case. All right. So to make this work, we'll need the most minimal specification for universal grammar. I know many of you don't like the term, but substitute it with your favorite term if you don't like it. But some minimal specification that would allow us to actually make interesting hypotheses about language, have a matching hypothesis about the brain, and then ask about its development and evolution. Okay? The easy part for the linguist, the one that I'll go over very, very quickly, that is, I want you to buy what I'm giving you, and if you don't want to buy it now, you can buy my forthcoming book, that's even nicer, is the following. I think that the minimal specification that we'll need, the non-negotiable part, if you want, of specification for universal grammar will need is just this. 3 properties. Don't be thrown off by the jargon. 3 properties that I think will be particularly useful in trying to relate a brain, mind, and evolution. One is, these are standard names. The first one is called the edge property. The second one is called merge. The third one is called the cycle. I'll explain briefly what I mean by these. By the edge property, I mean a very, very boring thing. I think it's actually a bad term, this edge property. But the boring thing I mean by this is that somehow with language, with the system we call language, we have access to atoms of computations. You can call them words. I prefer lexical items. It doesn't matter. But these lexical items have at least one property. The property of being able to combine with other lexical items. That's what I mean by edge property. Okay? That is, they might have certain restrictions, but there is certainly one computational potential they have, and it's the ability to combine. That's what I mean. Okay? I don't want you to think of words or lexical items as little trees with a lot of specifications. That's good for theoretical linguistics. That's not so good for biolinguistics. What I want you to think of when I say edge property, I mean a property that essentially starts with certain concepts that we share, for example, with other animals, but remove some of their, if you want, selectional restrictions, some of their valencies, as it were. What the edge property does for language is that it takes certain concepts coming from various modules or domains of the mind and makes them all available in one giant workspace, as it were, that we call language, and specifically the lexicon. That's what I mean by edge property, and we'll have to ask how this came to be. By merge, I just mean the boring combination of lexical items, so I just mean something like set formation. You shouldn't expect me to say that merge was the magic bullet. Certainly it was available in other species. Okay? And then the third component that I need will be what many people have called cycle or cyclic transfer, or even phases in aspects of the literature. By this I mean that after certain steps of combinations, the output, the temporary output of this computation in syntax is given for evaluation in other components of the minds. That's all I mean. Okay? But one thing, though, that's very important to realize is that if you buy both a set formation operation that applies iteratively and a sort of cyclic transfer approach, you get basically 2 modes of recursions immediately in language. And I think this in part led to the confusion of, well, do we have recursion or not? In fact, we have different kinds in language. One is what I've called direct or dense recursive pattern. That is, you combine without stopping. And a more indirect or sparse recursive system that transfers certain portions at different times but not continually. Okay? So you get 2 periods or 2 kinds of rhythms in syntax. Okay? In addition to this, what you need to make informative hypotheses about language with just these three things I've given you, you need to appeal to a rich cognitive structure or conceptual substance to, get our semantics, basically. Here you have three fantastic books. My favorite is more on the left, but the three of them are perfectly fine titles, showing that this rich cognitive structure is certainly there. I mean, if this I must buy. If you don't like the three books I've shown you, you can take a look at others. I think it's indisputable that other animals really gave us a lot of what we regard as natural language semantics. Okay? This, of course, has to be qualified somewhat in that as soon as you buy a rich conceptual structure and the three syntactic properties that I've given you, it may mean, of course, that the way we think, the way we manipulate those concepts that we share with other species may end up having a slightly different kind of representation. This is a hypothesis that I share with people like Paul Petrosky and Wolfram Hinzen, for example, that are on this slide, or Juan Oriagareca. But basically, when I say semantic thing, that shared is the name of the game here. On the other side of the grammar, the externalization side, here we are even luckier, or as lucky as on the semantic side. We share a lot with other species, perhaps not our closest relatives, but certainly with other vocal learners. It's actually remarkable that the properties that we are beginning to discover in the context of bird songs map in terms of the Chomsky hierarchy map exactly on the same point where phonological systems of natural languages map, namely the finite states and not beyond this. Okay, so here you have a couple of here you have the Heinz and Itzardi paper recently published in Science, showing that the kind of complexity we find in phonology, not the same as in syntax, is of the same kind that people like Kazuo Kanoya or Bob Berwick and others have shown is valid for birdsong. So that too is shared. That's something that we don't need extra properties from, at least for natural languages, but it's of course something that we recruit for language. Okay? And then you're saying, that's it? And I say no. And this is a slide that will hopefully please many of you, and I'll say it explicitly. In order for you to get from what I've given you so far to natural languages, you need to assume that in between there's going to be a lot of culture-based grammar formation, grammaticalization, and these sorts of operations that are crucial in order for me to get from the minimal specification I've given you that just gives you a rough scaffolding of syntax to the rich grammatical substance of modern-day languages. You guys are expert on this. All I'm doing here is say that I'll have to buy a lot of the things that you have on sale, because otherwise I won't be able to get from the underspecified UG that I've given you with these three properties to natural languages. So not only do you have a role to play, the approaches in fact need to complement one another. If you want, the minimal specifications I've given you are like the weak biases that, among many others, that we have cognitively will give you rise to culture-based grammar formation. Okay? Specifically, the culture-based grammar formation will be important in what we call the interface between syntax and phonology, what's called morphology. This is where things will get complex and messy. Okay? All right. So far, what I've given you is a picture that, at least for semantics or for phonology, both of sound and sign, for externalization, can draw on rich animal models. Maybe not as rich as we would like right now, but in a couple of years we'll learn more. The puzzle will be for the three properties that I've given you at the beginning, where are those coming from? Okay, and that will be my focus. It doesn't mean that that's the only interesting thing. Please don't say, is that FLN? Okay, don't ask that. But it means that this will be a particular puzzle that we would like to discuss. Okay? And in order for me to discuss the evolution of these properties, I'll have to say, first of all, how we could relate them to the brain. Okay? And here I have a hypothesis that's, I think, new, although it draws on components that are available in the literature. And the first component that I'll draw from is a hypothesis by Stan Dehaene, Changeux, and others that, unfortunately, I say unfortunately because, in the literature it's known as a hypothesis for consciousness and how consciousness is realized in the brain. I think that consciousness is a word that I'll try to avoid, okay, for just good science form, okay? But what Dehaene and Changeux has claimed is that our brain basically has the ability to construct what they have called a global workspace of the sort that I'll explain. And this particular global workspace is what I'll need to explain some of the properties that I've introduced before in the context of language. So they said it was for consciousness. I'm going to say no. Maybe it's for consciousness. I don't know, but at least it's interesting in the context of language. The model that Dehaene and colleagues have developed is actually drawing on the model first proposed by a philosopher, Bars, that says that there is a neuronal workspace that emphasizes the role of distributed neurons with crucially long-distance connections, particularly dense in prefrontal, cingulate, and parietal regions, that basically give rise to what Bars had called a blackboard image. That is, it's a workspace that enables you to reach beyond the confines of the modules that other animals have and that we certainly have. It basically gives rise to cross-modular computation. And that, I will claim, is precisely what the edge property enables language to do. Because if you remember, the edge property was this property on lexical items of words that essentially remove some of the combinatorial restrictions that are imposed in the various modules where those concepts reside. If you assume that if you can turn these into lexical items, they basically become available as part of this global workspace. Okay? And so if you want to explain the edge property, you'll draw on these long distance connections and ask how these came about. Okay? Dehaene and others have pointed out that this is reminiscent of the Fodorian architecture that Jerry Fodor put forth in the modularity of mind, but not in the sense that it appears to, in addition to modules, the central executive, and I'll tell you language may have been that, or at least syntax. I'll skip a couple of slides. These talk about the long distance connections that are necessary for this global workspace. Okay? Yes. What's interesting is that Dehaene has pointed out that once you have this global workspace available in your brain, you can do a few things that other animals couldn't do. For example, you have modular processors that are now able to exchange information very flexibly. Information can be accumulated across time and across different processors. We can discretize incoming information arising from analog statistical inputs, and we can perform chains of operations and branching. These properties, accidentally or not, match pretty well how Hauser, drawing on a lot of literature, define humaniqueness. Hauser pointed out that we, unlike other animals, have the ability to combine and recombine different types of information and knowledge in order to gain new understanding, apply the same rule of solution to one problem to a different and new situation, create and easily understand symbolic representations of computations and sensory input, and detach mode of thought from raw sensory and perceptual input. These would actually fit pretty well with how Dehaene would talk about the global workspace. So I think that there is a nice matching hypothesis there about what we can cognitively do and what we could draw from on the brain side. Okay? But this is not all. This is not, in particular, once you have this global workspace, you'll still need another component of your brain that will essentially regulate the way this global workspace works. And here I will hypothesize, again drawing on a lot of people, especially Francis Crick, who way back said that the thalamus could actually be that part of the brain that regulate basically cortical connections. There is very good evidence from this in the vision literature for the thalamus essentially acting like a clock or regulator of information exchange. But I think that the thalamus has also been implicated in functions outside of vision, and even in the context of language. The thalamus has been related to working memory, which of course, as everyone knows in this room, working memory is a misnomer. It should be called attention, okay? Selective attention in particular. It has nothing to do with memory. The role of the thalamus has been occasionally implicated in language. Here you have a reference. Here you have a second one. Friederici and colleagues, especially Duxetti, have even shown that the thalamus is sensitive to syntactic and semantic language violations. Interestingly, not phonologigical violations. Okay? So implicating the thalamus as a regulator for the global workspace may not be too crazy, even though it is not conventional. Okay? Here you have a couple of references for the thalamus acting as a clock. Okay? So far, people might have said, well, this guy has been trying to relate language as the brain, and still he hasn't mentioned Broca yet. So he must have missed something in Linguistics 101. And the answer is, no, I haven't. Well, yeah, I missed a lot of things in Linguistics 101, but not this one. In particular, I think that Broca's region has a role to play, but not the central role that many people often ascribe to it in the context of language. I don't think that it's specifically devoted to language, but it has a role to play, in particular, as part of a circuit that Michael Ullman and others have called the basal ganglia thalamocortical circuit. Note that the thalamus comes up again. More precisely, I think that Broca's area is crucially implicated in turning whatever computation of this global workspace regulated by the thalamus does to basically what is eventually becomes externalized in terms of speech or sign. And people like Peter Haggard have said that Broca could actually be a convergence zone precisely to do this kind of externalization process. Here's a slide drawing from Greg Hickok's work on Broca, showing that actually Broca should be decomposed in terms of the kind of computation it does. And what I find interesting, although I don't have too much time to tell you the details today, what I find interesting is that the decomposition that Hickok puts forth in the context of Broca matches precisely the sort of decomposition that linguists of a generative persuasion need to assume in order to understand the mapping from syntax to phonology. What's becoming very clear to many linguists is that morphology is actually not only a very messy component, but also a decomposable component. There is one side of morphology that directly relates to syntax, that's called morphosyntax. There is another one that's called morphophonology. And these two sides of morphology, I think, corresponds, if you go into the details, to how Hickok and others are decomposing Broca and the kind of computation that it does, some that are more local, more finite state than others. The more finite state ones would be more directly related to phonology. Okay. All right. What I've given you basically is sort of an anatomy of the language faculty, a rough anatomy of it in the brain. Physiologically, in order to make it work, we could draw from existing work, especially the work of Boeckx and others, that have actually come up with a model for what they call neural syntax. Don't be misled by the word syntax, but the way this works is that Boeckx have identified three components of how the brain works that match precisely the three properties of natural language syntax that I've given you, namely cell assemblies, synapse symbols, and readers that sort of match my edge property, set merge, and then cyclic transfer. So physiologically, we can actually draw on existing work to make it work. Okay. The question that, of course, people in this audience are asking is that is this kind of architecture that I've sketched evolvable? And I'll give you a couple of hypotheses that I think are currently available and sort of make this story interesting. It's no surprise if I start with telling you that the sort of brain we have is particularly large and complex. Lots of hypotheses about what exactly this means by large and complex. Okay, but what I think is far more important for the sort of story that I want to tell you is not so much the size of the brain, but actually the shape of the brain. That is, size will be a critical component for me to get from mind to brain and to evolution, but far more interesting will be the fact that the human brain, the sapiens brain, has a particular shape that makes it even more specific than its size. As you know, for at least given the information that we have, Neanderthals and others really also had a rather big brain, perhaps even bigger than us. But the shape of ours is particularly distinct in a way that will directly relate to some of the things I have given you. So here is a recent synthesis paper published in Evolutionary Biology by two people from the Max Planck Institute that, I'll give you just a slide that shows that more than size, shape really matters for us and should, of course, have played a role in evolution. Their synthesis actually starts with a hypothesis coming from Spain in 2003 by Brunner and colleague, where they have shown that the sapiens brain is much more globular than other brains that we know or can reconstruct, and they have based their hypotheses on trying to reconstruct brain shape from skulls that we have as fossils. I'll give you just one slide out of many I've given you that will make the thing clear. If you look on the left, we have the sapiens brain based on skull reconstructions, and then we have the archaic brain model in our lineage. And the main difference, the one that I want you to focus on, is on the fact that the sapiens brain looks much more like, is spheroid. It looks more like a ball than the archaic domain. The archaic sort of model is much more elongated. Ours is more globular. And that seems to be particularly salient in much of the literature reviewing this, and this is something that I'll just recruit. If you look at the development of how the brain works and you compare this with how the brain develops in our closest relatives, there is a stage very early in development postnatally in the context of human brain evolutions where there is basically, as you can see, two curves. The one on the left is for us, and the one on the right is basically giving rise to the archaic brain development model. And this sharp rise at the beginning gives rise to the globular kind of shape that gives our distinctness. This is comparing it with chimpanzees. This comparison, again, the same kind of sharp rise for modern humans. And on the right, in red, you have Neanderthals. And basically, you have size-wise something that basically reached the same level, if you want, but shape-wise it is very distinct. That is, you reach sort of the same target, global brain size, but through different roads. And these different roads, I think, make a difference. So development makes a difference for evolution. Okay? So this is another reference showing this. I should say that this kind of new development is not quite neoteny. It seems to have been like a particularly new stage of development that's not found in other species. And this was the sharp rise on the graph that I've shown you. Now, why should a more globular, a spheroid brain matter for what I've given you? Well, I think it matters if you take into account the fact that I've told you what regulates this global workspace is the thalamus. And if you look at where the thalamus lies, it's right in here. It's right in the middle, basically. It's this subcortical part that seems to be placed in a particularly advantageous location in the context of a spheroid kind of brain. Okay, so here is the thalamus in green, and if you see this, I'm sure that you're thinking of something like this. And it's known that this red point makes all the other points in the circumference equidistant, so equally accessible. And I think that this equally accessible is what the thalamus enables us to think cross-modularly. That is, it makes all the modules equally accessible. So here is the thalamus, and if you study the connection of a thalamus in a spheroid brain, they work much better than in the archaic elongated mode of brain size that other species have. A more globularized brain, in fact, minimizes distance between neurons and therefore reduces wiring length. This is a hypothesis that goes back to people like McCarthy, although they haven't been exploited in the context of language. And so it would increase cognitive efficiency and the sort of conceptual traffic that we engage in. Last point before conclusions. Would this be an adaptation, this globular kind of brain? We will probably never know. I'm sorry to tell you, but in order for us to reach the skull size, there are so many different things, so many different factors that could have actually enabled us to get there. Daniel Lieberman and many other colleagues of his have pointed out that various factors in our lineage could have eventually led to this globular kind of a brain that we have, and we'll probably never know which factor was the crucial one. So I think that this question is basically too hard. There are many conclusions that one can draw from it, but rather than taking more time, I'll stop here and let you ask questions. Thank you.
Okay, we have about 15 minutes for questions. Please raise your hands and identify yourself before asking the question.
Arnaud from the CNRS in France. Thank you very much for this very impressive integrative synthesis review. I just have a very simple question. Would you exchange concerning your three general principles, the words H by chunk, the word merge by association, and the word cyclic by chronological loop?
I didn't get the first one. I got
the first one is changing H by chunk. Which is a psychological concept.
And so H by chunk. Second one, merge versus association. Third one, phonological loop or cyclic transfer.
Right.
Yeah. Almost, but no. No. And I'll tell you why. I'm happy with the second one, the merge association. Yeah, I don't think this is such a big deal. I know a lot of people think of merge as this magic bullet. I'm not putting my money on that one. The reason I wouldn't like to make the substitutions that you suggest for the third one, the phonological loop, I think would only be part of what I've called cyclic transfer, because the sort of cyclic exchange of information from syntax to the other cognitive systems that interact with it, it's not just for phonology, it's also for meaning, right? That is, we relate to like the modules where those concepts reside, and so the phonological loop would be only one part, but the part dealing with externalization. So it wouldn't be enough. Okay, though it would be fun. When it comes to edge and chunk, I wouldn't like to make this substitution either. I think that chunking actually, as an operation, corresponds pretty much with what theoretical linguists call cyclic transfer. Okay, so to the third one, okay, as a process. And the edge property, I think is the one that's been emphasized the least in the theoretical literature, but I think it's the crucial one. It's basically, like I said, it's a well, I don't know simple or not, but it's an operation that essentially said you can now combine what before looked like conceptual apples and oranges. Okay? Liz Spelke has said that we as sapiens have become particularly smart, if you want, because we have become particularly flexible, conceptually speaking. It turns out that we have a system that enables us to combine things that were in the minds of other species but isolated from one another. And I think that what I've called the edge property, or the thing that defines lexical items, is precisely that. If you look at the literature, the one that I was alluding to on the rich conceptual substrate that we can draw from, one thing that's very clear from that literature is that the concepts that animals have very, very strict combinatorial restrictions. Okay, this is why they are so modular. That is, animals find it very hard to use a concept that they have from one domain and apply it to another domain. Okay, they are not generalists; they are experts, basically. We are experts too, but I think through language we sort of got a system that enabled us to become generalists. Okay, to give rise to this flexibility. And so I don't think chunking would give you that. Okay. Now, the edge property may not be the best word for it, but whatever it does, it should be an operation that essentially, it relies on those long-distance connections to create cross-modular, essentially, information transfer. Okay? So, I don't think... But behind your question, I think there is the model... there are certain models of working memory, central executive, and these things. Yeah, you're shaking your head. Yeah, in part, it's not too different from it. There are differences, but the sort of hypothesis I've sketched would actually fall within the same family, if you want, if you are generous with how the family is defined.
Other questions?
There's someone
One
there.
here, and I see two over here and one back, so let's start here. Let's try to keep the questions and the answers fairly brief so that we can try to get in.
I think 20 minutes should be enough for this one.
For the answer?
Well, for the question and the answer combined. So I'm struggling to try and synthesize the views of the two biolinguists, you and Piatelli Palmarini.
Why would you do that?
I have, because you are both in some sense offering a starting point based on the same concepts of linguistics. And then I saw two things in common I'd like to comment on. First, the emphasis on the globular. The globular eye of the jellyfish was the key for Piatelli Palmarini. The globular shape of the brain was the key for you. The other thing I see in common is that there's absolutely no discussion of communication unless it is to dismiss it as relevant, as Massimo did, or to ignore it as you did. And I'd like to know how you think, or whether you think not, the ability to communicate more effectively could play into an evolutionary story, or is it just some chance of acceptation at the end of the whole thing?
Yeah, that's the question?
I think it's...
Okay. Yeah. No, I thought there was something more coming up. No, well, the globular thing, we haven't met before. Yeah. The communication part is interesting. It's not quite ignored in this talk, although it's not mentioned just because I only have a finite amount of time. I think it does play a role, but not as centrally as other people think. That is, there was one slide where I said that in order for me to get from this minimal specifications that I started off to like full-fledged languages of the sort we know it today will have to rely on essentially cultural evolution of the sort that many people have investigated. And I think
the biology did not relate to communication. It was only when a modern brain was around that suddenly these things were used for communicative and social purposes.
Roughly yes. Roughly yes. Okay, so it's not like it doesn't play any role, but it didn't play a role in the origin, but it certainly played a role in its subsequent evolution. Okay?
I suspect we disagree.
Okay.
I suspect we
so
do.
this hand in the middle back.
Russell Gray, University also. How does a more spherical brain explain edge, merge, and cyclic transfer?
I'm sorry, I didn't get that.
How does your more spherical brain explain edge, merge, and cyclic transfer?
It doesn't explain the three. What it does is having a more... So it's far more indirect than this. So this is why I don't like terms like FLN or highly specific properties, so specific to language. What I think the globular brain did is essentially locate the thalamus in a particularly advantageous position to regulate a global workspace that, strictly speaking, our closest relatives or Neanderthals could have actually had. It just wasn't as efficient for them. Now, this efficiency is precisely, I think, at the heart of what I've called the edge property, namely the ability to make use of those long-distance connections in an efficient way to relate, to essentially engage in cross-modular information transfer, conceptual transfer. And because the thalamus is the regulator of the global workspace, having a more globalized brain essentially enables that kind of regulation to be more efficient. That's the idea. So it doesn't give you the suite of the three properties, okay? But it essentially enables these three properties to work pretty well in tandem and give us the cognitive flexibility that Spelke and others have identified in the realm of psychology. That would be the idea.
Just a quick follow-up. Have you calculated the difference in efficiency?
I personally haven't, but others have. Okay, and this is a hypothesis that, like I said, goes back to, I think, the late 80s by McCarthy and others, showing that, depending on the position of the thalamus, you may actually have that. Now, what hasn't been done, what's kind of homework for me afterwards, is linking the global workspace of the Dehaene and et al. Group to the results of the thalamus that other people have already reached. That's the homework. Okay, so that's the hypothesis. That's where it might fail. So if it turns out indeed that the two hypotheses don't combine as well as I think they ought to, then what I've said would be incorrect.
I guess I'm just rather skeptical that a small difference in efficiency is going to produce all of action.
Okay, there are several other people with their hands up, so I'd like to pass the mic around. I think I see two people at least in this area, so whoever gets there first.
Barbara Wadowska Tomasz, University of Lodz in Poland. First question refers to one of the points of a discussion between a translation between concepts to linguistic units, lexical units to be precise. How do you envisage that? That is, because this is the essence of rise of language. That is, concepts vis-a-vis lexical linguistic units. That is, this nebulous sets of concepts to things that you neatly, precisely show as homogeneous type of lexical units. Where is this homogeneity? Are you thinking about some universal lexical layer that is non-language specific, a universal lexical basis? Because when we translate it into real lexical systems, then of course it's less neat, more heterogeneous. Point two, what is so Cartesian about this model? I mean, there's no mind-body duality, isn't it? I mean, it's mainly an outcome of biology. So there's no mind as a separate entity. I'd rather call it more materialistic than Cartesian. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for the first question. You're right. This is something that this is where assumptions come in, and I forget to make them explicit. This is correct. When I talked about the edge property and the difference between concepts and lexical items, I was assuming that the lexical pool that we draw from to combine is indeed not specific to specific languages. Okay, that is, it's universal in a way that's not like French versus English or something. French versus English versus Navajo and so on, the lexical differences there comes crucially after the process of cultural evolution. This is where, so in order to get from my kind of lexicon, the pool of lexical resources that I have, to specific language lexica, then you really need processes like grammaticalization and other things that really then introduces differences and variations. So that's correct.
Thinking of a Leibnizian set of universal concepts then? Leibniz,
Well, I don't know what Leibniz was thinking, honestly. But yeah, they would be universal. For the second question, yeah, if it's not Cartesian, that's okay, I think. I briefly toyed with the idea of calling this the mind's body plan, but then I thought people would say mind and body together on the same slide, but that's okay.
Okay, I'm sorry to say, I think we have to stop here. Is that true? Yeah, this is the end of the first plenary session. So if you have further questions, there's still a few days of the conference, so please try to call on Cedric during one of the breaks. Thank you very much.
Thank you.